On the afternoon of November 3rd, 1983, a quality control inspector at a defense manufacturing plant in Paterson, New Jersey, noticed something that would expose one of the most sophisticated Soviet sabotage operations ever attempted against the United States Army. His name was Thomas Brennan. He was 42 years old, and he had been working at Precision Components Manufacturing for just over 14 years. The plant produced hydraulic systems for M1 Abrams tanks, critical components that controlled everything from the main gun's elevation to the suspension system that allowed the 60-ton vehicle to traverse rough terrain at speeds approaching 45 miles per hour. What Brennan discovered that afternoon, hidden inside a batch of precision-machined valve housings destined for Fort Benning, Georgia, wasn't just a manufacturing defect or a quality control failure. It was evidence of systematic industrial sabotage, and if the components had made it into operational tanks, they would have caused catastrophic failures in some of the Army's most advanced fighting vehicles at exactly the moment when Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Understanding what Thomas Brennan found and why it mattered requires understanding the larger context of American military production in the early 1980s and the specific vulnerabilities that existed within the defense contracting system. The Reagan administration had initiated the largest peacetime military buildup in American history, pouring billions of dollars into modernizing every branch of the armed forces. The M1 Abrams tank program alone represented an investment of over $4 billion by 1983, with contracts spread across dozens of primary manufacturers and hundreds of subcontractors scattered throughout the industrial heartland of the United States. Precision Components Manufacturing was one of these subcontractors, a mid-sized facility that employed approximately 380 workers, producing hydraulic components not just for tanks, but for military aircraft, naval vessels, and ground support equipment. The plant occupied a sprawling complex of buildings that had been constructed in the 1950s, originally as a civilian manufacturing facility, before transitioning to defense work during the Vietnam era. By 1983, roughly 70% of the plant's production was dedicated to military contracts, with the remainder consisting of commercial hydraulic systems for construction equipment and agricultural machinery. Thomas Brennan had started working at the plant in 1969, fresh out of technical school with a certification in precision machining. He'd spent his first 8 years operating lathes and milling machines on the production floor before moving into quality control in 1977, a position that required meticulous attention to detail and an understanding of tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Quality control in defense manufacturing was not the kind of work that generated headlines or drew public attention, but it was absolutely critical to ensuring that components performed as designed under the extreme stresses of military operations. A hydraulic valve that failed to seal properly could cause a tank to lose steering control in the middle of combat. A fitting that cracked under pressure could spray superheated hydraulic fluid across sensitive electronics or onto crew members. The consequences of failure were measured not in production delays or warranty claims, but in lives lost and missions compromised. Brennan's workstation was located in a cordoned-off section of the main production floor, where completed components were subjected to a series of tests before being packaged for shipment. His responsibilities included dimensional verification, using precision measuring instruments, visual inspection for surface defects or machining errors, pressure testing to ensure components could withstand their rated specifications, and documentation of every test result in logbooks that would eventually become part of the official quality assurance records submitted to the Defense Contract Administration Service. On November 3, 1983, Brennan was working through a batch of valve housings that had been completed the previous day. These particular components were part of the hydraulic system that controlled the M1 suspension, allowing the tank to maintain stability while moving at high speeds across uneven terrain. Each valve housing was a complex piece of precision engineering, machined from solid blocks of aircraft-grade aluminum and featuring internal passages, threaded ports, and sealing surfaces that had to meet tolerances within 0.001 inches to function properly. The batch consisted of 240 valve housings, and Brennan's procedure was to randomly select 10% of the units for detailed inspection, a sampling method that was standard practice in defense manufacturing and had proven statistically reliable for catching systematic problems before they reached the field. He had already inspected 18 units that morning, finding nothing unusual, when he picked up the 19th housing from the rack and positioned it under the magnifying lamp at his workstation. The first thing he noticed was a slight discoloration around one of the threaded ports, a subtle darkening of the aluminum that wasn't immediately alarming but caught his attention because it was inconsistent with the appearance of the other units he'd inspected. Brennan wiped the surface with a lint-free cloth, thinking it might be residual cutting fluid or handling marks, but the discoloration persisted. He grabbed a 10-bic magnifying lamp from his tool tray and examined the area more closely. What he saw made him pause, his hands still holding the component, his mind trying to process what his eyes were reporting. Around the threaded port, barely visible even under magnification, were a series of tiny pits in the aluminum surface, each one approximately the size of a pinhead, clustered in a pattern that didn't match any machining marks or tool wear he'd ever seen. The pits weren't deep, probably less than a few thousandths of an inch, but they were there, and they shouldn't have been. Aluminum doesn't spontaneously develop pitting like that, not unless it's been exposed to some kind of chemical attack or corrosion, and these components were less than 24 hours old, stored in a temperature-controlled environment that was specifically designed to prevent any kind of degradation. Brennan set the component down carefully and reached for another unit from the same batch. He examined it under the loupe, focusing on the same threaded port location. The pits were there, identical in size and distribution. He checked a third unit, a fourth, a fifth. Every single component he examined showed the same pattern of surface pitting around the same threaded connection points. His first thought was that something had gone wrong during the machining process, that perhaps a coolant had been contaminated or a cleaning solution had been too aggressive, causing minor surface damage that would be caught and corrected. But that didn't make sense either, because if it was a process problem, he should have seen it in the earlier units he'd inspected that morning, and he hadn't. These were the first components showing the defect, and they were all from a specific production run that had been completed during the second shift the previous evening. Brennan made the decision that would ultimately unravel the entire operation. Instead of simply rejecting the batch and sending it back for rework, which would have been the standard procedure for a minor surface defect, he decided to investigate further. He took one of the affected valve housings to the metallurgy lab, a small facility at the back of the plant where more sophisticated testing equipment was available for analyzing material properties and investigating failure modes. The metallurgist on duty that day was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had joined the company 2 years earlier with a PhD in materials science from MIT. Brennan explained what he'd found and asked if Chen could take a look at the surface under higher magnification to determine what might have caused the pitting. Chen positioned the component under a stereoscopic microscope at 50 Bex magnification and adjusted the lighting to get a clear view of the affected area. What she saw immediately caught her attention, not because the pitting was particularly severe, but because of its characteristics. The edges of each pit were sharp and well-defined, consistent with chemical attack rather than mechanical damage. The pits themselves appeared to follow the grain structure of the aluminum, which suggested that whatever had caused them was selectively attacking certain crystallographic orientations within the metal. Chen grabbed a cotton swab and carefully collected a sample from inside one of the pits, then prepared a slide for analysis under the microscope. When she examined the residue, she found traces of what appeared to be a chloride compound, possibly from some kind of salt solution. That was unusual, because the manufacturing process for these components didn't involve any chloride-containing chemicals. The machining coolants were chloride-free specifically to prevent corrosion issues, and the cleaning solutions were all pH neutral and designed for use with aluminum. She ran a more detailed analysis using the lab's scanning electron microscope, which could provide both high-resolution images and chemical composition data through energy-dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. The results were clear and troubling. The pits contained elevated concentrations of chlorine, sodium, and traces of other elements that had no business being present in a freshly machined aluminum component. Chen looked at Brennan and asked him a question that would become central to everything that followed. Where exactly in the production process had these components been, between the time they were machined and the time they arrived at his inspection station? Brennan pulled the production traveler, a document that moved with each batch through the manufacturing process and recorded every operation, every inspection point, every person who had handled the components. According to the traveler, the valve housings had been machined during the second shift on November 2nd, finishing around 10:30 am. They had then been moved to the deburring station, where sharp edges were removed using abrasive media, then to the cleaning station, where they were washed in an ultrasonic cleaner to remove any machining oils or debris. After cleaning, they had been dried in a low-temperature oven, then moved to a temporary storage area where they sat overnight before being delivered to Brennan's inspection station the following morning. The traveler showed that the deburring and cleaning operations had been performed by a worker named Viktor Petrov, who had signed off on completing both steps around 11:15 p.m. Chen asked if that was unusual, if one person normally handled both operations. Brennan explained that it wasn't uncommon, especially on the second shift, when staffing was lighter and workers often covered multiple stations to keep production moving. But something about the timing bothered him. The deburring and cleaning steps should have taken at least an hour for a batch this size, but Petrov's signatures were only 45 minutes apart, which seemed fast. Chen suggested they take another look at the components, this time focusing specifically on the internal passages and sealing surfaces that wouldn't be immediately visible during a standard inspection. Using a borescope, a fiber optic inspection device that could see inside the complex internal geometry of the valve housings, they examined several units from the batch. What they found was more disturbing than the surface pitting. Inside the internal passages, particularly in areas that would be subjected to high-pressure hydraulic fluid during operation, there were additional deposits of the same chloride compound they'd found in the surface pits. The deposits were thin, almost invisible to the naked eye, but they were there, coating surfaces that needed to remain absolutely clean to function properly. If these components were installed in a tank's hydraulic system and subjected to the high temperatures and pressures of normal operation, the chloride deposits would accelerate corrosion of the aluminum, potentially causing the valve housings to develop leaks or even catastrophic failures after relatively few hours of operation. It wouldn't happen immediately, which made it particularly insidious. The tanks would pass their initial acceptance tests, would be delivered to operational units, and the failures would only manifest after the vehicles had been in service long enough that the sabotage would be difficult to trace back to a specific source. Brennan and Chen looked at each other, and the unspoken question between them was clear. Was this deliberate? The decision was made to take the information to plant management immediately, and to do so in a way that didn't alert anyone who might be involved in whatever had caused the contamination. Brennan called the plant manager, a man named Robert Hastings, and asked if they could speak privately about a quality control issue that needed immediate attention. Hastings had been with the company for over 20 years, and had a reputation for taking quality problems seriously, particularly when they involved defense contracts. When Brennan and Chen arrived at his office at 2:30 that afternoon and explained what they'd found, Hastings' first reaction was to question whether they were certain the problem wasn't just a process contamination issue, something that could be explained by a mistake in the cleaning procedure or a contaminated batch of coolant. Chen walked him through the evidence, the location and characteristics of the chloride deposits, the fact that they appeared only in components processed during a specific shift by a specific individual, the timing inconsistencies in the production records. Hastings listened carefully, asked several technical questions, and then made a phone call to the company's security director, a former Army Counterintelligence Corps officer named James Whitmore. When Whitmore arrived at the office 20 minutes later, Hastings briefed him on the situation and asked for his assessment. Whitmore's questions were different from Hastings's. He wanted to know about Viktor Petrov specifically. How long had he been employed at the plant? What was his background? Had there been any security concerns or unusual behavior? Did anyone know much about his personal life or associations outside of work? Hastings pulled Petrov's personnel file from the locked cabinet in his office. Viktor Petrov had been hired in September 1981, approximately 2 years earlier. His application showed that he was 38 years old, had immigrated to the United States from Poland in 1979 as part of the wave of immigrants that followed the political liberalization movements in Eastern Europe during that period. He had technical training from a vocational school in Warsaw and had worked as a machinist at several civilian manufacturing facilities in Poland before emigrating. His references had checked out during the hiring process, and his work performance had been satisfactory with no disciplinary issues or complaints. On paper, he was exactly the kind of reliable, skilled worker that defense contractors needed to meet their production quotas. But Whitmore saw something else in the file that caught his attention. Petrov's address was in a neighborhood of Paterson that had a significant population of Eastern European immigrants, and his emergency contact was listed as a cousin who lived in the same building, but there was no other family information, no spouse, no children, no parents or siblings mentioned anywhere in his employment records. Whitmore made a decision that would set the investigation in motion. He told Hastings not to confront Petrov or change anything about his work schedule or assignments, not to discuss the contamination issue with anyone else in the plant, and to continue production as if nothing had been discovered. Then he left the office and drove directly to the FBI field office in Newark, New Jersey, approximately 15 miles from the plant. The FBI had a standing relationship with major defense contractors in the region, maintaining contacts for exactly this kind of situation, instances where industrial security issues might have counterintelligence implications. The special agent Whitmore met with was a man named Daniel Sullivan, who had been working Soviet counterintelligence cases for nearly a decade, and who understood immediately why Whitmore was there. Sullivan listened to the account of what Brennan and Chen had found, asked detailed questions about Petrov's background and behavior, and then made several phone calls to FBI headquarters in Washington and to the Defense Investigative Service, the agency responsible for security clearances and investigations involving defense contractors. By the evening of November 3rd, less than 8 hours after Thomas Brennan had first noticed the discoloration on that valve housing, a multi-agency investigation had been initiated. The FBI would handle the criminal and counterintelligence aspects. The Defense Investigative Service would review security procedures at the plant and conduct background investigations on relevant personnel, and the Army's Criminal Investigation Command would assess the potential impact on military readiness if contaminated components had already been delivered to operational units. But the immediate priority was to determine whether Viktor Petrov was acting alone or whether he was part of a larger network, whether this was an isolated incident or evidence of a systematic sabotage campaign targeting multiple defense contractors. The decision was made to place Petrov under surveillance immediately, to monitor his movements, his contacts, his communications, looking for any indication of who he might be working with or reporting to. The surveillance operation began on the morning of November 4th when Petrov left his apartment in Paterson to drive to work. FBI agents followed him in unmarked vehicles, maintaining a careful distance to avoid detection while documenting everywhere he went and everyone he interacted with. At the plant, he followed his normal routine, arriving at 2:45 p.m. for the start of the second shift, which ran from 3 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. He clocked in, changed into his work clothes, and took his position at the deburring station where he would remain for most of the shift. FBI agents had coordinated with plant security to have cameras positioned where they could observe Petrov's work area without being obvious, and additional recording equipment had been installed to capture any conversations he might have with other workers. For the first week of surveillance, Petrov did nothing that seemed unusual. He came to work on time, performed his assigned tasks, took his breaks in the cafeteria, where he occasionally spoke with other workers but never about anything that seemed suspicious, and went home at the end of his shift. Outside of work, his routine was similarly unremarkable. He stopped at a grocery store twice during the week, visited a Polish delicatessen on Saturday afternoon, attended a Catholic church service on Sunday morning, and spent most of his evenings at home in his apartment. There were no meetings with suspicious individuals, no unexplained trips, no behavior that suggested he was engaged in espionage or sabotage, but the FBI was patient, and they had seen this pattern before in other counterintelligence cases.
Soviet intelligence officers and their agents were trained to maintain careful cover, to live normal lives that would withstand casual scrutiny, and to avoid any behavior that might draw attention.
Meanwhile, investigators were conducting a thorough review of Petrov's background, going beyond the standard employment verification that had been done when he was hired. They discovered several inconsistencies that hadn't been apparent during the original hiring process. The vocational school in Warsaw, where Petrov claimed to have received his training, had no record of anyone by that name attending during the years specified on his application. The manufacturing facilities where he claimed to have worked in Poland either no longer existed or had no employment records going back that far. His immigration paperwork showed that he had entered the United States through New York in March 1979, claiming political asylum as someone who feared persecution in Poland due to his support for democratic reforms, a common and generally credible claim during that period when the Solidarity movement was gaining strength. But when investigators contacted the immigration attorney who had supposedly handled his asylum case, they found that the attorney had retired in 1980 and had no clear recollection of Petrov's case. The pieces were starting to suggest a pattern that counterintelligence professionals recognized, the hallmarks of a false identity or legend that had been constructed well enough to pass initial scrutiny, but that didn't hold up under detailed investigation. On November 12th, 9 days after the initial discovery, the FBI made a tactical decision to take a more aggressive approach. They obtained authorization to conduct a covert search of Petrov's apartment, a so-called black bag job that would be done while he was at work, and that would leave no evidence that anyone had been inside. The search team entered the apartment on the afternoon of November 13th, while Petrov was at the plant. What they found confirmed the investigators' suspicions and elevated the case from a potential industrial sabotage investigation to a major counterintelligence operation. In a locked desk drawer in the bedroom, hidden beneath a false bottom that required precise manipulation to access, the search team found several items that had no innocent explanation. There was a one-time pad, a booklet of random number sequences used for encoding and decoding messages in a cipher system that was unbreakable if used correctly, and that was standard equipment for Soviet intelligence officers and agents. There was a hollow coin, a U.S. quarter that had been machined to create a small hidden compartment inside, the kind of device used for concealing microfilm or written messages. There was $500 in cash, mostly $100 bills, divided into envelopes and hidden in different locations throughout the apartment. And there was a small notebook containing what appeared to be coded notations, columns of numbers and abbreviations that didn't immediately make sense, but that cryptanalysts would later determine were records of payments received and tasks completed. But the most significant find was a set of 3 glass vials, each about the size of a medicine bottle, containing a clear liquid. The vials were labeled in what appeared to be Russian, with markings that suggested chemical formulations. The search team carefully photographed the vials in place, then extracted them for laboratory analysis, replacing them with identical-looking vials containing distilled water in case Petrov checked his hiding place. Chemical analysis conducted by the FBI laboratory over the next 48 hours determined that the liquid in the vials was a concentrated solution of sodium chloride and ammonium chloride in a water alcohol base specifically formulated to cause accelerated corrosion of aluminum alloys when applied to metal surfaces and allowed to dry. The solution was designed to be nearly invisible after application, particularly on the complex internal surfaces of precision-machined components where it would be extremely difficult to detect without sophisticated testing equipment. The FBI now had evidence of espionage and sabotage, but they still needed to understand the full scope of the operation. How many components had been contaminated? Were there other agents working at the same plant or at other defense contractors? Who was Petrov's handler, the Soviet intelligence officer who was directing his activities? The decision was made to allow the operation to continue under controlled conditions while building a comprehensive case. Petrov would be allowed to continue his normal routine, but the FBI would now be watching every component he touched, every person he interacted with, every movement he made outside the plant. Additional undercover agents were placed inside the facility, posing as new hires or temporary workers, positioned where they could observe Petrov's activities without being detected. On November 18th, Petrov made a move that the surveillance team had been waiting for. After leaving work at the end of his shift, instead of driving directly home as he normally did, he took a circuitous route through Paterson, making several turns that appeared designed to detect or evade surveillance. The FBI tail stayed with him, maintaining distance and using multiple vehicles to avoid being spotted. Petrov eventually parked on a side street in a residential neighborhood about 3 miles from his apartment, got out of his car, and walked 2 blocks to a small park that was empty and dark at that time of night. He sat on a bench for approximately 15 minutes, during which time FBI agents positioned themselves where they could observe without being seen. At 11:47 p.m., a second man appeared, walking into the park from the opposite direction. He was approximately 50 years old, wearing a dark overcoat and carrying what appeared to be a newspaper. He sat on the same bench where Petrov was sitting, positioned about 3 feet away, and for the next 8 minutes, the two men had a conversation while appearing to anyone watching casually to be strangers who just happened to be sitting on the same bench. The FBI surveillance team couldn't hear what was being said, but they photographed the second man extensively, capturing images from multiple angles that would be used to identify him. When the conversation ended, the second man stood up, left his newspaper on the bench, and walked away in the direction he'd come from. Petrov waited exactly 3 minutes, then picked up the newspaper, folded it under his arm, and returned to his car. The FBI followed the second man to a parking lot 2 blocks away, where he got into a vehicle with diplomatic license plates registered to the Soviet mission to the United Nations in New York City. The man was later identified through photographic comparison as Sergei Mikhailovich Volkov, a consular officer at the Soviet mission who was believed by U.S. counterintelligence to be a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. Volkov drove back to Manhattan, and FBI surveillance teams followed him all the way to the Soviet mission compound, where he entered through the secure entrance. Meanwhile, other agents followed Petrov back to his apartment, where he was observed through long-range surveillance equipment taking the newspaper inside. The newspaper itself would prove to contain a coded message written in invisible ink on one of the inside pages, instructions for Petrov's next assignment and confirmation of payment for work completed. The FBI now had established a direct connection between Petrov and Soviet intelligence, evidence of an active espionage operation targeting U.S. defense production, and documentation of at least one meeting between an agent and his handler. But they wanted more. They wanted to identify any other agents who might be part of the same network, and they wanted to understand the full scope of the sabotage campaign. How many other defense contractors had been penetrated? How many contaminated components had been delivered to the military? Were there other workers like Petrov at other facilities, systematically degrading the reliability of American military equipment? The investigation expanded to include reviews of production records at Precision Components Manufacturing going back 2 years, to the time when Petrov had been hired. Investigators examined every batch of components that Petrov had processed, looking for patterns that might indicate when contamination had occurred. They found that the sabotage hadn't been continuous. There were long periods, sometimes lasting months, when components processed by Petrov showed no signs of contamination, followed by brief periods, usually lasting only a few days, when multiple batches would be affected. The pattern suggested that Petrov was receiving specific instructions from his handlers about when to contaminate components and when to maintain normal production, probably timed to avoid detection through statistical quality control sampling while still causing maximum damage. Metallurgical testing of archive samples from previous production runs confirmed that contamination had been occurring intermittently since at least April 1982, approximately 18 months, meaning that hundreds of potentially compromised components had been delivered to the Army during that period. The Defense Department immediately initiated a recall of all hydraulic components manufactured by Precision Components Manufacturing during the time frame when contamination might have occurred.
Tank units at Fort Benning, Fort Hood, Fort Knox, and other installations were ordered to remove and inspect hydraulic valve housings from their M1 Abrams tanks, looking for signs of accelerated corrosion or degradation. The inspections revealed that several tanks had already developed problems with their hydraulic systems, failures that had been attributed at the time to normal wear or manufacturing variations, but that now appeared to be the result of deliberate sabotage. Fortunately, none of the failures had occurred during combat operations. The M1 hadn't been deployed to any active conflict zones yet, but the potential consequences were staggering. If a tank lost hydraulic control during combat, it could become immobilized, unable to traverse its main gun or move effectively, making it a stationary target for enemy forces. On December 2, 1983, exactly 1 month after Thomas Brennan had first noticed something wrong with that valve housing, the FBI decided to make their arrests. Simultaneously, teams of agents moved on Viktor Petrov at his apartment in Paterson and on Sergei Volkov at the Soviet mission in Manhattan. Petrov was taken into custody without incident at 6:15 in the morning when agents knocked on his apartment door and identified themselves. He made no attempt to resist or flee, simply stood there for a moment with a resigned expression and then asked if he could get dressed. The search of his apartment that followed, this time conducted openly with a warrant, recovered additional evidence including microfilm copies of classified documents related to tank production schedules and technical specifications, multiple sets of false identification documents, and over $30,000 in cash hidden in various locations throughout the apartment. Volkov, protected by diplomatic immunity, could not be arrested, but he was declared persona non grata by the State Department and ordered to leave the United States within 48 hours. The Soviet government issued a pro forma protest about American harassment of diplomatic personnel, but privately they understood that Volkov's cover had been blown and that any attempt to defend him would only draw more attention to an operation they would prefer to see forgotten. Volkov departed for Moscow on December 4th, and he never returned to the United States. Viktor Petrov, meanwhile, was charged with espionage under Title 18 of the United States Code, specifically with conspiracy to commit sabotage against military equipment and materials in violation of federal law. His trial began in March 1984 in the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey, and the government's case was built on the physical evidence found in his apartment, the surveillance documentation of his meeting with Volkov, the testimony of Thomas Brennan and Dr. Sarah Chen about the contaminated components, and the expert analysis of the sabotage methodology. Petrov's defense attorney attempted to argue that his client had been coerced into cooperation with Soviet intelligence, that he had been threatened with harm to family members still living in Poland if he didn't comply with orders from his handlers. But the prosecution presented evidence that Petrov had been paid substantial sums of money over an extended period, that he had been living well beyond his stated income, and that his actions had been systematic and deliberate, rather than reluctant or coerced. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and on April 27, 1984, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Sentencing occurred on June 15th, with the federal judge noting the seriousness of Petrov's crimes and the potential danger he had posed to American military personnel. Viktor Petrov was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. He would ultimately serve 28 years before being released on parole in 2012, by which time the Cold War had been over for more than 2 decades, and the Soviet Union no longer existed. The investigation into whether other agents like Petrov were operating at different defense contractors continued for several more years. The FBI cross-referenced Petrov's known contacts and activities with personnel records at other facilities that produced components for military equipment, looking for similar patterns of background inconsistencies, unexplained wealth, or production anomalies that might indicate sabotage. They found several other suspicious cases, though none as well documented as Petrov's, and additional arrests were made at facilities in Ohio, Michigan, and California between 1984 and 1986. The full scope of the Soviet sabotage campaign was never completely determined, in part because the evidence was fragmentary, and in part because the Soviet government was not about to acknowledge the existence of such a program. But counterintelligence officials estimated that at least a dozen agents had been placed in defense-related manufacturing facilities during the early 1980s, each operating independently but all following similar methodologies. The impact on U.S. defense production was significant, but not catastrophic. The recall and replacement of contaminated components cost approximately $75 million and delayed several tank deliveries by 6 to 8 months, but no American service members were killed or injured as a result of the sabotage. The M1 Abrams tank went on to prove itself as one of the most reliable and effective armored vehicles ever produced, seeing combat in the Gulf War, Iraq War, and other conflicts with a record of performance that vindicated the Army's investment in the program. But the Petrov case fundamentally changed how the Defense Department approached industrial security. New procedures were implemented requiring more thorough background investigations of workers with access to critical components, enhanced quality control testing that specifically looked for signs of sabotage rather than just manufacturing defects, and improved coordination between defense contractors and federal law enforcement agencies. Thomas Brennan, the quality control inspector who had noticed that first subtle discoloration on a valve housing and decided to investigate rather than simply reject the batch, received a letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Army and a cash award from Precision Components Manufacturing. He continued working at the plant for another 15 years until his retirement in 1998, and people who knew him said he never considered himself a hero or claimed credit for stopping a major sabotage operation. He was simply a man who took his job seriously, who paid attention to details, and who understood that in defense manufacturing, small things mattered. Dr. Sarah Chen, the metallurgist who had performed the critical analysis identifying the chloride contamination, went on to become the Director of Quality Assurance at Precision Components Manufacturing and eventually left to start her own consulting firm, specializing in failure analysis for aerospace and defense applications. The Precision Components Manufacturing facility remained in operation until 2007, when the company was acquired by a larger defense contractor and production was consolidated at other locations. The buildings in Patterson were eventually demolished and redeveloped as commercial office space. There is no historical marker, no plaque, no public acknowledgement that anything significant happened there. But for those who worked on the investigation, for the counterintelligence officers who understood how close the operation came to causing serious damage to American military capabilities, the case remained a reminder of the constant vigilance required to protect critical infrastructure and defense production from hostile intelligence services. The story of Viktor Petrov and the contaminated valve housings is in many ways typical of Cold War espionage and sabotage operations, not because it was spectacular or dramatic, but precisely because it wasn't. There were no car chases, no shootouts, no confrontations at scenic locations, just a factory worker who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence to use his position and skills to degrade the reliability of military equipment, operating quietly for months until one observant quality control inspector noticed something that didn't look quite right. In the vast machinery of the Cold War, with its nuclear arsenals and superpower confrontations and geopolitical chess games, it was these small, unglamorous operations that often had the potential to cause the most immediate and tangible damage. The Soviet intelligence services understood that they couldn't match American technological superiority through direct competition, that they didn't have the industrial capacity or economic resources to produce weapon systems that were qualitatively superior to what the United States was developing. But they also understood that complex military systems were only as reliable as their weakest components, and that if you could introduce systematic weaknesses into critical components, you could neutralize much of America's technological advantage without ever having to build a better tank or a more sophisticated weapon system. The sabotage campaign of the early 1980s represented that strategy in action, an attempt to use industrial infiltration and systematic degradation to accomplish what direct military competition couldn't achieve, that it was ultimately unsuccessful, that agents like Petrov were identified and arrested before they could cause catastrophic damage, owed something to good intelligence work and law enforcement cooperation. But it also owed something to people like Thomas Brennan, who were simply doing their jobs with care and attention, who noticed when something wasn't quite right and decided to investigate rather than ignore it. In the end, the Cold War was fought not just by intelligence officers and military planners, but by ordinary workers in factories and offices who understood that their daily responsibilities had implications far beyond their immediate work environment. The valve housing that Brennan examined on that November afternoon in 1983 was just one component among thousands produced that day, just one small piece of metal in a vast industrial supply chain, but it became the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an intelligence operation that had been running successfully for years. And it all started because someone paid attention,